U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has caused great tension and controversy across the Taiwan Strait, but the U.S. insists their one China policy has not changed. Does Pelosi's visit have any legal standing? Is the U.S. ignoring the historical facts of the Taiwan question? How have the three joint communiques laid the legal foundation for diplomacy between the two countries?
The story goes back to 1971 when former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made his first visit to China, opening a new chapter in China-U.S. relations. Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai, where the then Chinese premier expressed his hopes for improved bilateral ties. This trip paved the way for the groundbreaking of the 1972 meeting between then Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong and U.S. President Richard Nixon, ending 23 years of diplomatic isolation and mutual hostility. At the conclusion of this trip, China and the U.S. signed the Shanghai Communique, the first communique between the two sides. In the document, both nations pledged to work toward the full normalization of diplomatic relations. The U.S. stated they acknowledge that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. Both sides agreed to respect each other's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the two nations agreed to take action against any country establishing hegemony in the Asia-Pacific. The second communique was an achievement of then U.S. President Gerald Ford's visit to China in December 1975. Known as a joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations, this document formally announces the commencement of normal relations between the two nations. In doing so, the U.S. again acknowledged China's position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. In addition, Washington also declared it would end formal political relations with Taiwan, and both sides reaffirmed their wish to reduce the risk of international conflict. On January 1, 1979, China and the U.S. officially opened their diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level. In the same year, at the invitation of then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's first visit to Washington raised bilateral ties to a new level. The two governments issued the third communique on August 17, 1982. This document reaffirmed the desire of both sides to further strengthen economic, cultural, educational, scientific, and technological ties. Both sides also reaffirmed the statements made about the Taiwan issue in the previous communique. Washington declared its intent to gradually decrease its sale of arms to Taiwan. The three joint communiques built the bilateral foundations between the two sides.
Before the signing of the three joint communiques, there was little diplomatic contact between the two sides. What then prompted the American overtures in the 1970s?
At that time, the Cold War is a heyday, and the United States realized that the split of then the Soviet Union China is deep and irreconcilable. Therefore, it serves U.S. interests to form a better and closer relationship with China so that to create a balance against Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in U.S. favor. Another factor is that United States at that time would want to withdraw from the Vietnam War, which of course is a trap. And without China's help, it would be more difficult. So if United States has a good relationship with China or better relationship with China, at that time it is hoped that United States can gain some leverage in withdrawal from Vietnam War, which of course it did.
With the incentive to normalize bilateral relations, both sides came to the negotiating table, and Taiwan was at the top of the agenda.
There is some very subtle but significant differences between the two sides. Dr. Kissinger is really clever or smart. At that time, China's position, of course, is Taiwan is part of China, no questions asked, period. But Dr. Kissinger said, the Chinese on both sides think there is one China and Taiwan is part of China, which means the United States will not take a position on this. This is your problem. How to solve it is between, at that time, the Khmer Taiwan and of course, the mainland China. Because at that time, the ruling party of Taiwan is Kuomintang, which firmly holds the position firmly that there is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. Of course, there are two explanations of what China really is. But we have to remember and emphasize that at that time, when the two countries, I mean China and the United States, normalized the relationship, United States did recognize solemnly that there is only one legal representative of China, that is People's Republic of China. In other words, People's Republic of China is a legitimate government, represent the whole China. That position is a common point, is a key point that two countries can normalize its relationship in 1979.
But as of now, this common point has been challenged as Pelosi's dangerous provocation is distorting, altering, obscuring, and hollowing out the One China principle and trying to cross the red lines and push the boundaries.
We don't have that respect for those original agreements any longer. And the U.S. is acting in its self-interests. We understand that. In fact, I'll even go so far as to say, every country has the right to act in its self-interest. Okay, fine. That's an understandable thing. China does, and I'm glad that they do. But we must look at and acknowledge, and we say if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck. And what we have here is the United States acting in its self-interest, and they obviously have, as I love to say in my favorite Chinese phrase, 过分了. They have gone over the line. They have breached the One China policy. They have breached this idea of we have China's basis for diplomacy. The basis for diplomacy between the countries is the One China policy. Okay, I'm not going to be overly aggressive in criticizing it. It's a big, big problem. It's a danger, and I'm not sure what's going to come next.
No one knows what comes next, but one thing we do know is that this visit contradicts the U.S. commitment to the One China principle. In the face of condemnation from the Chinese side, Pelosi has attempted to justify the congressional delegation's visit as falling under the guidance of the Taiwan Relations Act and the Sixth Assurance to Taiwan. Is the trip really legitimate, as she claims?
During her trip to Taiwan, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said her visit does not contradict long-standing U.S. policy, guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, U.S.-China joint communiqués, and the Six Assurances. In fact, she is wrong. Her visit contradicts the joint communiqué in 1979 establishing ties between the U.S. and China. The joint communiqué of the United States of America and the People's Republic of China clearly states the United States of America recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China.
Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of China.
Pelosi, second in line of succession for the U.S. presidency, is clearly an official of the U.S. government, which thereby defies the agreement. But this doesn't seem to bother Pelosi, as just 3 months later, in April 1979, the U.S. Congress approved the controversial bill called the Taiwan Relations Act and changed the wording from unofficial relations to other relations. It also stated the U.S. will continue to provide support to Taiwan, including supplying weapons to reinforce Taiwan's military capability. China registered strong opposition to the act as it legitimized arms sales to Taiwan, an obvious violation of China's national sovereignty and amounts to interference into China's domestic affairs. On August 17, 1982, China and the U.S. issued the third joint communiqué on U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, where Washington agreed to gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan and then stop altogether. However, this upset Taiwan secessionists, so the U.S. created the Six Assurances, a document outlining U.S. policy principles to assure Taiwan of its support to the region despite cutting formal diplomatic relations. It also assured Taiwan that the U.S. did not agree to set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. had played both sides, to the mainland by pledging to reduce arms sales, and also to Taiwan by reassuring the region there was no set date for ending arms sales.
美方所谓的与台湾关系法 The so-called China Relations Act, cited by the U.S. side, gravely violates the One China principle and the 3 China-U.S. joint communiqués and essentially places domestic law above international obligations. It is illegal, now, and void. On the Taiwan question, the U.S. should abide by the One China principle and the 3 China-U.S. joint communiqués rather than something it unilaterally concocted.
For decades, the Chinese side has consistently opposed the U.S. practice of creating domestic laws to defend their relations with Taiwan.
If we look at the issue from the perspective of 3 communiques as agreed by both sides, obviously, Taiwan Relations Act is a unilateral product, as you just said. But we have to remember, unilateralism actually is what hegemony is all about. I mean, a very important demonstration of a hegemon is that it can do things unilaterally, and the United States has been doing this all the time. Doesn't matter who is in the White House. But the point here is that you cannot and should not, one cannot and should not, impose a unilateral decision or unilateral act upon a solemnly, mutually agreed a principle or policy, which is a foundation of the normalization of the relationship between 2 major powers. That, I think, is a very reckless and also in long term could lead to a disaster which would damage the interests of both sides. Having said that, we also have to acknowledge that Taiwan Relations Act actually is a play of the domestic politics of the United States, which has remained a major problem in the bilateral relationship vis-a-vis the Taiwan issue. For example, this visit of Pelosi to Taiwan is actually, in my view, in a large part because of the internal politics of the United States. Mm-hmm. Of course, what is damaged, again, is a bilateral relationship of the United States and China, and in my view, also the interests of the United States itself.
It's no surprise that there is rivalry between different entities, especially major countries. The question really is it a managed rivalry? And if it's a managed rivalry, which is the thing that prevents it from breaking into all-out war or confrontation, even accidentally, if it's a managed rivalry, it has certain foundational principles, and it has, as the Chinese have also said, and I think this is an apt metaphor, certain guardrails so that the car doesn't go off the road. And the guardrail really has been the One China policy, the One China principle, the fact that Taiwan, as Jimmy Carter made it explicitly clear, that Taiwan is part of China and that the U.S. acknowledges that Taiwan is part of China. For Nancy Pelosi to crash through the guardrails, to basically tear down the guardrails, so that as the car, and let's think of the car as the rivalry between China and the United States, or the relationship between these 2 countries, as the car goes around the curves and up and down, and there's no guardrails, it becomes very dangerous. And that's why, it's correct to call this a strategic level provocation. Why did Nancy Pelosi feel confident enough to do it? I mean, this has been Nancy Pelosi's position for a long time. She's a China hawk. And I think it's because Biden has said on 3 different occasions, so it's not a stumble, 3 separate occasions, that the U.S. is prepared to use military force when it comes to Taiwan. And this follows 4 years ago when the Pentagon released its new quadrennial report, its new doctrine, preparing our country, America, for major power conflict with China. So the compass has been reset. The guardrails are being torn down, and that's what makes this such a precarious, dangerous moment. And frankly, I want to say this so that the Chinese audience and the universal audience, the international audience, hears that this is not what the American people want. After Vietnam and Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, war after war, the last thing the American people want is a confrontation, especially with China.
Another controversy over the Taiwan question between China and the U.S. is arms sales. And going back on its word is nothing new in U.S. history.
In the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan disagreed both with normalization with China. He wanted to restore official ties to Taipei, and he also thought that Taiwan should be able to buy whatever weapons it wanted in the United States. This led to a crisis that was about 18 months long and culminated in negotiations over the course of 1982 Most of them conducted at my dining table in my apartment in Sanlitore in Beijing. And this resulted in a communique in which basically both sides had to be more explicit, but return to the normalization understanding. That is, the Chinese had to accept that the U.S. was going to continue arms sales for a while to Taiwan. The U.S. had to accept that it couldn't do so indefinitely. But on that basis, we reached a compromise, and it produced exactly the results that we'd hoped for. It gave Taipei an incentive to drop its refusal to talk to Beijing and to enter into a political dialogue with it, which then resulted in the so-called One China consensus. In other words, Taipei had to look for non-military means of managing its security and autonomy vis-a-vis the rest of China. And Beijing had a powerful incentive to send every signal it could of peaceful intent to keep the U.S. reducing the arms sales to Taiwan. And that worked for 10 years until the 1992 election, when election considerations catalyzed a decision to make the largest U.S. arms sale ever to anywhere, 150 F-16s to Taipei. That broke the communique framework and effectively remilitarized the issue, an issue that had been demilitarized.
What I make of this type of flip-flopping is just really an earlier example of what we have now that's escalating, which is obvious. We have a specific, intentional, I even want to go so far as to say disrespectful, breach of the One China policy. It's when Pelosi spoke on soil, standing in Taiwan, in the morning of her remarks, she referred to our countries, and she was talking about the United States and Taiwan. So we just have a direct breach. And what I think I want to do now is talk more about the question that's really on everybody's mind, which is to say, why is the United States acting so incredibly recklessly? And in order to answer that question, all we have to do is look at what's happening around the rest of the world. Now, this all began, 70 years ago, post-World War II. It's disturbing to me because, I'm an American. People like myself, other politicians in America, like Tulsi Gabbard, economists like respected Jeffrey Sachs. We're all scratching our heads as Americans. We're disturbed by what our government is doing because it's on a warmongering warpath.
Nancy Pelosi, the number 3 in line in the U.S. power hierarchy, is creating a disturbance for not only China but also the Asia-Pacific at a time when everyone else is advocating global solidarity against a plethora of challenges. We don't know the reasons for or the consequences of Pelosi's visit, but we do know this dangerous provocation is raising tensions in the region, violating the One China principle and undermining China-U.S. relations. Broken vows are like broken mirrors. They leave those who hold on to them bleeding and staring at fractured images of themselves.